Gigantopithecus. Gigantopithecus, as you can see, a pretty huge primate, lived in roughly where China is, East Asia, at about 300,000 years ago. Very big, very strong, maybe stronger than those gorillas. Now, I show you this picture to say that if you went back in time, if we rewound the evolutionary clock, say about 300,000 years, or really to any time in the past, and you surveyed the creatures that were around on the planet, you might not think that the ones that ended up surviving would be the ones that would make it. If you were to go back in time, now Gigantopithecus is not with us. It did not turn into Bigfoot or anything like that. Don't worry. It's not around. It went away because it was probably too well adapted to its environment. And so if you rewound the clock, though, and went back, say, 200, 300,000 years, and you looked at these puny little Homo sapiens running around with their little tools and goofing off. And then you looked at Gigantopithecus being all big and strong and dominating the forests of China. You might be like, that's the one that's going to make it. I'm putting my bets on Gigantopithecus. They're going to rule the earth. They're stronger, bigger. Look at that big head, smarter. All right. So you might put your bets on this one. And so I would just caution you. A lot of you use words like survival of the fittest. Again, it depends on the environment. So a lot of times what happens is when a creature gets too well adapted to their environment, they get so fit that when the environment changes, then they can't change. Then they're gone. We might call it extinction of the fittest, because as the environment changes, if you're too well adapted, you can't be flexible and move on. So some people believe that one of the reasons that we here today are still around, Homo sapiens, and not Gigantopithecus, is because what we call they call survival of the generalist, of the more flexible, of the more adaptable, you might say, to multiple environments and to change. Now, I don't know if we'll be able to do this, if we'll be able to keep going like this. Again, we get very into ourselves and we think how successful we've been. And then we say, we must have been so smart, us Homo sapiens, and we outwitted all these other creatures. You think about it, there is some probability, at least, that in the next few hundred years or so, we're going to end up destroying ourselves. I don't want to be pessimistic, but the way things are going. And then if you look back on us, you'd be like, wow, those guys were awesome for 20,000 years or so, and now they're gone. So they weren't so awesome anymore. So when we look back at these creatures, some of them made it for 1,000,000 years as a species. We're nowhere near their success in any sense. So you need to be humble when we come to these ideas. So today we are talking, though, about human origins. So here we have what they call a simplified diagram of human origins, a tree-like structure. And again, this is simplified. But as I hope you can see here, there's a lot of branches and bushiness and creatures in all different places of this tree. And like I said, there's a simplified version. And as people made different fossil finds, they get very excited about them. And everybody that finds a fossil wants to believe that they found the fossil or the creature that's going to be very important. How do we open this chapter with a very exciting fossil find? You might have even seen this on TV. It is very dramatic. It's an amazing find, and we should be happy to have it. What do we open with? Homo naledi. Yeah, in South Africa. And just to find it was an incredible feat. It was found in a cave structure. There were actually 5 women who basically had to shimmy down into this cave and then go around and then shimmy back up. Wonderful find, amazingly preserved. This is awesome. This is a creature that you quoted as is on the cusp of being human. And they were like, oh, wait, we may have found the creature that's between Australopithecus and Homo sapiens, and it's so cool, and look at them all. And then they finally were able to date the remains. And it turns out Homo naledi dates back to about 200 or 300,000 years ago. So basically, this is a creature that was around, that overlapped with Homo sapiens, but is not Homo sapiens. It's an exciting find. It's an interesting find. It's important, but it does not seem to be on what we might consider the main line. It's an overlapping to human evolution. In fact, the more we find, the more complicated it gets. So actually, let's start with that. Why do we have, when we tell the story of human origins, the first question I want to talk about is why we have so many mysteries, debates, complexities. Why is it so complicated? You're like, well, we have 6,000, but some of them are just one tooth or one arm bone, right? So we end up, like I've said, we end up talking a lot about teeth because teeth are what preserve better than other things. And people make whole reconstructions of creatures from, say, a tooth and a jawbone. In fact, Gigantopithecus that I just showed you is basically reconstructed from teeth. We don't have a lot more than the teeth. And sometimes it's one tooth. You got a tooth and you have to try and figure this out. So the fossil record is very fragmentary. There's stuff, and we're finding more of it. But the truth of the matter is that certain regions produce fossils and certain regions just don't have any at all. The environment in a tropical forest is not good for producing fossils. There are specific conditions under which fossils can happen. And in some cases, there may have been creatures there. It may be important, but you just don't have any fossil evidence for that. Now, this is in part because when you were alive, the main goal of being alive is not to become a fossil. You don't want to get stuck in a tar pit, or buried in a cave, or anything like that. You're trying to just stay alive. And also, what happens to you? Let's say you're walking around and then you're somewhere in a forest or you haven't become a fossil, but you die. What's the next thing that's going to happen to you? Say you're walking in the woods out there. I don't want to be too gruesome or grim about this, but what's the next thing that's going to happen if nobody picks you up? Yeah. Get eaten. That's right. You're going to get eaten by other creatures, the scavengers. And it's estimated that's what happened to the rest of the Gigantopithecus fossils is the porcupines ate them. So mean porcupines eating up the fossils. But this is what happens to most creatures. And if you die, they either decay or get eaten. They don't actually become fossils. And even in the regions that produce fossils, there'll be huge time gaps. So it might have been good for fossils at 1 million years ago, but then another 500,000 years will go by before you get the next fossil. So it's hard to tell what happened in that time if you don't have anything to go on. There's another challenge here, which is how we determine what a species is. So when we're trying to figure out, well, are these the same species with variation, or are they different species? Are species trying to branch off here? Or are they basically just the same? By the way, how do we know what a species is? They can reproduce, and their children can reproduce. So the famous horses, donkeys, and mules, horses and donkeys remain separate species because the mules don't get to reproduce. But yes, they have children that can reproduce or they have children. They can reproduce and have children. But here's the problem. How do you determine what exactly is an interbreeding species from fossils? You got a couple bones or a couple teeth, and you're supposed to try and figure out if those creatures could have interbred or not. So for human beings today, for example, we're pretty phenotypically diverse, as we talked about, and maybe paleoanthropologists of the future would look at us and be like, I don't know if those people can all reproduce. We know that we can, but sometimes it's difficult to figure out what's going on in the fossil record way back then. So I want to talk now also about what we used to think. That is to say, the things we used to be looking for, the ideas we used to have as we looked at human origins, and some of the things that we have to get away from today. What were we always looking for? What did you want to find there in the evolutionary record? Oh yeah, right. We're always interested in the big brains. Like I said, humans are usually way up on themselves, and we always used to look for big brains in the record. We always thought that we're going to find creatures back there a few million years ago that had big brains, and that was what was going to distinguish ourselves from those other dumb apes out there. We're going to have these big brains and be talking. And I'll talk about this in a second. But we were also looking for this idea that there were missing links. That is to say that every creature had to come from another creature, and so there was going to be these smooth transitions between different creatures. And again, this idea that there was this ever-ascending line that led from ape-like creatures up to humans as the brains got gradually bigger and bigger and bigger, and the walking got better, and the language and the talking got better, that there was one smooth line in evolution. Of course, at the time, say 70 years ago or so, there was only fossil evidence. The only thing you had to go on was those teeth, different fossils that you've had. And so the idea was that the biological evolution part came first, that the brain came first. And after that, we add on learning, tools, culture. These are the ideas that were prevalent when people were looking back, say 100 years ago, at human origins. And to be honest, this got people into a lot of trouble. You may have heard of some very famous hoaxes, like the Piltdown Man, where somebody just stuck a jaw of a chimpanzee together with a skull of a Homo sapien and said, I found the missing link. Now, this was a hoax, but people believed it because they thought that the big brains were what was so most important about the transition between the apes and the hominins. So let's talk about what we think now, what we are more secure of. First of all, as we've talked about with the primates, we are not actually looking for missing links. The idea of missing links, we didn't talk about this, but it comes from a much older idea called the Great Chain of Being that was around in the Middle Ages. But what we are looking for are creatures that are ancestral to a divergence of creatures later on. And so what we think about human origins is we are looking for a creature, the common ancestor is going to be like a chimpanzee or a bonobo, but it's not going to be the same as either a human, a chimpanzee, or a bonobo, because both chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas, for that matter, have all been evolving all this time. So they had a common ancestor back then, but they are also evolving. And as we talked about in the last class, the chimpanzees and the bonobos actually had a species split after the last common ancestor. What we think was the first thing to develop was bipedalism. At around 7 million years ago, some of those ape-like creatures became more habitually bipedal. They had ape-like crania and ape-like brain size, but they were walking around. Now, I want us to be clear about this. The big brains, the larger brains, don't show up in the record until about 3 million years ago, 2 to 3 million years ago. And so it took 4 million years between the bipedalism and the big brains. Some of you wanted to know if there was a correlation between bipedalism and big brains. Doesn't seem to be, because for 4 million years, there were bipedal creatures that didn't have that much of a bigger brain. Again, we think that this divergence between the creatures that would lead to more ape-like creatures and the creatures that would be hominins is around 6 to 9 million years ago, as we talked about ape-like brain size, but becoming more mobile, more able to cover varied terrain, and able to walk habitually on two legs. Now, the other thing we now know is that there were many different species, or at least a very wide variation, all through the hominin stage and into the Homo stage. Like we just talked about Homo naledi. We'll talk about different kinds of Homo creatures next week on Tuesday. But the point of the matter is there are all kinds of different creatures. Some people count many species. It depends how you count. Some people say it's a range within a species. We've also discovered that species don't just break off and the next thing you know, they're completely separate. Sometimes they hybridize again. And some people think that that is how a lot of the human evolution came about, is people would, or these creatures would break off from each other and then get back together. And they wouldn't maybe be perfectly interbreeding, but some of those hybridizations would cause greater genetic change. And so we've developed a much more bushy model of evolution. I showed you that tree diagram, but it's much more spread out. And we've also discovered there's lots of overlaps between these creatures. It's not that just one creature gives way to another. There might be a variety of creatures around at the same time. And so it's tricky to figure out who's related to whom and who's on the main line of things. Some people call this mosaic evolution, or in our textbook, they call it a mosaic of traits. And that is to say that there's different combinations of these traits in different creatures, and it isn't, again, a smooth progression. So for Homo naledi, for example, it's a great example of a mosaic of traits, seemed to be very bipedal, had very human-like wrist structures and arms, but very small brain. And so, again, there was debates about where this creature is going to be located, but it turns out it's not really on the main line and exhibits this mosaic trait. The other thing that happens is we draw on different people. We bring in all kinds of different experts. So we have people who do the fossils and the archaeologists in there. But we also have people who do the genetic stuff, people who do the environment, geologists, trying to come up with more accurate interpretations of the creatures of the past and the environment of the past as well. And one of the perhaps surprising things about this is that the more genetic evidence that we have, the more complicated things seem to be. So everybody believed that the genetic evidence was just going to sort everything out. And once we had that, we'd have a simpler story of human evolution. So many of you love the molecular clock because it sounds very mathematical, and it does help us a lot. But the fact is that the genetic evidence has increased our knowledge of the complexities of some of the interbreeding and the intermixing and the hybridization that went on in human evolution. And this is very important, especially for us as anthropology people, is that making tools, learning from parents and each other, is very deep in human origins. It goes back at least 2.5 million years ago, where we have evidence of stone tool manufacture. We'll talk about this more in the next class, but what that means is that it isn't biology first. You don't get a big brain first and then add on culture. You, in fact, have this tradition and cultural difference in making tools and learning from each other as the biology is developing. So something that we might call culture or learned behavior is very deep in the human lineage, and it is in fact one of the key reasons that we are human. So we have a much more complex idea and a much better way to situate the finds of the fossil record. This is not going to resolve all these debates, but we have a pretty good picture of what happened. Now, in your lifetime, there are going to be more finds and there's going to be revisions to this. We still have very excellent evidence of human evolution in general, but there are definitely going to be different adjustments to the model as we find more evidence. So let's go back, do some specifics here. We talked about how, well, back here, those monkeys that ended up in South America and Central America, they split off way back there, became the monkeys they are over there. But we have also a common ancestor of the what they call the old world monkeys, or the monkeys of Europe, Asia, and Africa, with the apes. And then we have some apes here, the gibbons we talked about, these lesser apes, common ancestor of about 18 million years ago. Then the orangutans do their own thing. At about 12 million years ago or so, you have the gorillas going off. And then we have about, again, 6 to 9 million years ago, the ancestor of hominins, chimpanzees, and bonobos. The human chimp last common ancestor, very nice. Yes, the HCLCA, the human chimp last common ancestor. Now, some people still say the missing link, but let's not. As they say, it's colloquially. Some people just informally refer to this as the missing link, but it's really not. We're looking for the last common ancestor of humans and chimps. What does the human chimp last common ancestor look like? Yeah, that's a terrible question, because in fact, we have very little idea what this would look like. We have very little fossil evidence from the tropical rainforests of back 9 million years ago. Somebody did snap this picture, so that was good. Now, we don't know. This is a good try. Some people say that it would be something that would be like a chimpanzee or bonobo, but maybe like a gorilla too, because that would be around then. But there it is. Yeah, you take information from, you can do this with all kinds of different species as long as you have some fossilized evidence or something that you can extract DNA from, and you estimate in terms of genetic mutations over time. Now, this isn't perfect. We don't want to get too excited about any one method, but it gives us another data point on when this happened. And so we have the molecular clock method to estimate this. And what we see here is that it's just at about 6 to 9 million years ago, we see this last human chimp, last common ancestor, and a gradual divergence of 2 or more species from that. Now, I really want to emphasize the gradual part. This doesn't happen like overnight. This isn't an instant occurrence. It's something that creatures get separated from each other, and then they develop differently, then they become different species. It's a gradual process that this happens. So the question then becomes, if we were to find a fossil back about 7, 8 million years ago, how would we know if it's a hominin or an ape? How would we know that? Hard to tell which side of the divide you're going to put this one on. You're looking for a presence of traits. Now, like we said, a lot of people would like to say there's a big brain, but the real trait that you're looking for to divide up these things between the creatures that we would call hominins and the creatures that would lead to apes is the bipedalism part, the walking around. We're still going to have the same brain size for about 4 million more years. But bipedalism evolved first 7 million years ago. Now, again, in the used to think category, people got very excited about bipedalism, and they thought about the grasslands, the savanna of Africa, and they thought about these bipedal creatures popping their heads up and walking out with spears, getting ready to hunt some animals. If you're on the grasslands of Africa and you're popping up with a big head and a spear, and remember, when we talk about popping up, we're talking about creatures that are about as tall as preschoolers, and you're popping out over the grasslands and you're ready to hunt something, what is going to happen to you? Big cat. A big cat. Yes, you're going to be eaten immediately by a lion or one of the huge predators that exist on the African savanna. And so this is hilarious. These preschoolers that go striding onto the savanna. This is actually one of the potential disadvantages of being bipedal. As they say, seeing better across the landscape also meant hominins could be better seen by predators. So you want to be careful about popping your head up over the grasslands, especially when the big cats are around. So it doesn't seem that this idea of the grasslands hunting idea is that plausible. And what happened to the forest there in Africa? It was getting smaller and smaller. So it is true that the African tropical forest became more fragmented and there were more open areas. However, what do we know about the grasslands of the Africa? Yeah, the grasslands, it wasn't as pure grasslands as they thought. So what seems to have happened is there were different areas of forest and grasslands, kind of a more patchy landscape. And bipedalism might facilitate being able to deal with trees and grasslands and not necessarily just these vast open areas. They make a case, and that is probably a big aspect of bipedalism, is that it frees your hands to do different things, especially things like carrying babies if you're having to travel over this varied landscape, or carrying food, or eventually the tools. Potential advantage there for freeing the hands. They also talk about thermoregulation, that is to say when you are standing up instead of having your back exposed to the sun in some of these areas, it helps to cool off the body. And the idea that you could save energy by walking from place to place bipedally conserves energy as opposed to four-legged movement. If you are doing that over time, getting between different areas, endurance walking tends to be an energy saver. Now, again, I want to be cautious here. The environment was changing, and some of these creatures that were adapted to the environment in different ways began to die off or go extinct. And so again, there's not necessarily a survival of the fittest as much as it is people that are differently adapted to different environments. Now, there's something else that's interesting about this, is the idea later on, it turns out that being able to run over long distances is one of the fun things that human primates can do that other primates can't. So human can do a pretty good endurance running, and some people believe this is how humans were able to hunt down four-legged prey, which are faster in short distances. Don't be confused. Being bipedal doesn't give you a speed advantage over the four-legged creatures. Don't try to outrun bear. They will not make it. But over a long distance, humans are the only primate that can do endurance running. It does seem that barefoot running does not do as much damage because of the different gait and stride as some of the sport shoe or athletic running that we do today. And so again, bipedalism is one of those things that, as in all things evolutionary, has trade-offs. So you're standing up, you might be more visible to predators, and there's not one necessary reason that bipedalism gives you an advantage. But these are possibilities for why bipedalism became important.